Hello, my name's Mike Talty. I work for Microsoft in the UK, so that's Mike Talty and from Microsoft in the UK. And you can find me on my website, http://mtalty.com. You can find me via email, mtalty@microsoft.com. And you can find me on Twitter at mtalty. All different ways to get hold of me. This is one of a number of short videos around Silverlight 4. Silverlight 4 is Microsoft's RIA technology. And these videos are for the Active Tuts site. And this is not the first video along these lines that have gone onto the site. If you want to find more of a sort of intro, overview kind of video, if you go to http://activetuts/sl/intro, then that's more of a sort of overview set of a couple of videos there to give you more of a flavor of things. What I want to talk about in this particular video is data binding, or at least the basics of it in Silverlight 4. And in order to do that, I'm going to use some tooling like we've done in some of the other videos. I'm going to be using Visual Studio 2010. If you haven't got a copy of this, you can get a copy including the Express edition, which is free, and you can get that from http://vswebexpress. Just download that and install it. I'm also going to be using the Silverlight tools for Visual Studio, so it's a little bit that you have to add. So the Silverlight 4 tools for Visual Studio, and you can get those by going to http://silverlight4tools. And then finally we might wander into Expression Blend. And Expression Blend is the design tool for Silverlight applications. I don't have a shortened link for this. You can get it from http://microsoft.com/expression. And if you follow the links there, you should be able to find Expression Blend on that particular site. So with that said, let's go and talk a little bit about the basics of data binding. Data binding is kind of fundamental inside of Silverlight, so whether we'll get to see absolutely everything here remains to be seen. But let's see how we get on, and instead of playing in Notepad here, let's go and spin up Visual Studio. Okay, so inside of Visual Studio, let's just use File, New Project to make a new project, going with the default naming. And I'll just ask Visual Studio to make me a website as well to host that project. And it whirs away and creates me my projects, specifically a Silverlight project and a website to host it. Okay, so I've got my design surface here, which is full screen Visual Studio. And I can go and make that more of a design split between my design and my XAML, as we've seen in some of the other videos if you watch the tutorial about working with XAML. But if I want to work with data, then typically the way I represent data in my application is with classes that hold the values for that data. So let's go over to our application over here and add a simple class. Let's go ahead and say add a class. And that class can be, let's call it person.c#. I use person because that's a very familiar concept really. And we can go to person. And then on the person class we could add some properties that represent some data. In Visual Studio you can type prop and hit tab twice to throw in a little snippet for typing in properties. So this would be a property, let's say, called first name on the person. I have a property called, say, last name on the person. Let's have a property called age on the person as well. So we've got 3 simple properties on that thing. I'm just going to hit the build menu in Visual Studio just to build that. And then let's go over to the XAML and the UI and build up a simple representation of this data on screen. So let's go over to our UI. Now, what I'm about to do here is just a shortcut really inside of Visual Studio to save me some typing. What I can do is go over to the Data Sources window in Visual Studio. If you don't have that window, remember you can always go to the View menu and find different windows on there. And if you don't find the window you're looking for, always remember there's a window or a menu called Other Windows. So somewhere between those 2 lists of windows you should be able to find all the windows you ever might want. And let's go over here and just say we'll add a new data source based on an object. And that object can be a person. I'll just say finish. What this gives me is a handy little thing that I can use to just represent a details view and just drag it onto the design surface. And that just gives me some generated stuff that I'd otherwise have to type in. Having done that though, I just want to tidy this up a little bit because it's a little bit complex for our needs in the first instance. So I'm just going to go into this. I'm going to get rid of this resource stuff that's been thrown in. I'm going to get rid of this loaded event that's been thrown in. I'm going to get rid of all these settings here on this grid. I don't need them. I'm going to leave the grid row and columns. If you looked at the layout video, we had a label generated for us by the by the designer, that's fine. I'm just going to leave that label in there. But on this text box here, we've got a lot of properties that right now I don't want, so I'm just going to tidy that up. The label again for first name here is fine, but on this text box again I've got a lot of properties that I don't want, so I'm just going to tidy those up. And another label for last name, and finally on this text box at the bottom a lot of properties that I don't want, so I'm just going to tidy that up. Okay, great. I could have typed some of this stuff in, I just chose not to do it simply because it was quicker just to drag some stuff out. Whilst I'm here though, I'm just going to use this document outline to select my 3 text boxes and go to their properties and give them a minimum width. Let's just specify of 192 there, so that they just always show up, because they're sizing themselves to the content at the moment, which is not what I want. Okay, great. So at the moment we've built a blank user interface, and if we were to run this with debug start debugging or F5, the browser will pop up. It'll show the blank user interface. Let's just let that spin up. There's the browser. There's the blank user interface, because we have no data behind this. Now what I want to do with these controls is start to tie them to my data. So for instance, this text box here, I want to tie it in some way to a property on my data. And it's kind of interesting because in Silverlight you can do this very, very simply and very, very powerfully. You can pretty much take any property of a control like this. So let's take the text in this particular case, and you can apply a data binding to it, which we do with this binding syntax. And in this case we want to bind that to the property called age. So that establishes that the text on this particular text box is going to be drawn by a property called age from some object somewhere. And one of the powerful things about Silverlight is that we don't have to say here which object it's going to be. We leave that. That's not necessary to specify that right now. Let's do the same thing for our other text boxes. So we have another text box here, and this guy is the one who's going to get its text from the binding to a property called first name. And let's go down to this text box here and let's specify its binding. Text equals binding to a property called last name. By the way, it's also possible to set up these bindings in the properties window as well, so I'm just kind of doing it manually here. Now obviously the missing piece is, how does the text box find the last name on the right data object? How does it know which data object to use? Well, it turns out that every single element that you find like this has a property called a data context. And the data context is the way in which a control will find its data. So the data context is the object that a control will look at for, in this case, a property called last name. That's how it works. Now it would be really tedious if you had to set the data context on every single element. That's kind of tedious to do, but you can do that if you want to. If I set the data context on this text box, then the text box would use the object I'd assigned in the data context. However, if I don't set the data context, then the text box will look to its parent, in this case this grid here, let's just find it, and see if it has a data context. And if it doesn't, it'll look to the parent, and it will even look to the parent up here. And so what that means is that we can set a data context for the whole user control, and that will apply to these particular text boxes. So let's do just that. Let's go and drop to the code behind this XAML here, and let's just say this, because we are the user control, dot data context equals, and let's create a new one of those person objects we just made, and let's specify some properties at creation time, and those properties might be the first name, Fred, the last name, Smith, and the age might be 22 or something like that. So we specified a data context as a valid object. We've got these right properties here. So if we press F5 and run this inside of Visual Studio, launching up the browser, running the application, we should see that our data automatically shows up inside of those particular text boxes in this case. Let's just shut that back down. Now we can take this simple example a little bit further. Let's put onto the screen another text box just for argument's sake. So let's just go to the toolbox. Let's just find a text box up here. Or maybe we could just have a text block, which is something you can't actually edit. So let's put a text block on here as well. And we'll just let it go down here, I think, rather than up there. And space it out a little bit. And let me just set properties on it to make it a little bit bigger. So let's set the foreground on this to be red. Just go set that to be red. And let's set the font size to be a little bit bigger, of 14 or something like so we can kind of see it a little bit more. And let's take that text block, and once again, it has a property called text, it so happens. Let me just tidy up some of the things that are going on with it here. Let's just perhaps tidy up a little bit. We'll probably get in a mess by tidying up these, but let's not worry too much. This also has a property called text on it, and let's say that this is also bound to the property, let's say first name. So this property is also bound to the property first name. Let's press F5 and run this again inside of the browser. And so you can see we've got Fred showing up in two places. But if I start to edit this text here to say Bob and hit the tab key, notice that this hasn't updated at all. So that's kind of strange. We got the initial read of the data, but it's not updating, which is a bit limited. There's two reasons why that's happening. One is that bindings that we create in Silverlight have a notion of direction. And so on our text box for first name, we can actually specify a mode, and Visual Studio helps you with this, of one way, two way, or one time. Essentially, one way means the data flows from the object to the control. Two way means it goes in both directions. So if you run that, you might expect that that would give us some kind of sign of life, that when we type data in here, we bob and hit tab, but still it doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work is that what is happening is we are changing now the value of the first name in the underlying object, but that change of that value is not being communicated to the other person that's interested in the binding, which is this text block down here, which is bound to the very same property. So how do we make sure that our object living behind here actually notifies that other piece of UI that something has changed? Well, the way it works is you implement an interface in Silverlight called iNotifyPropertyChanged. And I'm just going to use Visual Studio to fill out the namespace there for me, bring in that namespace so that that's correct. And I'm also going to use Visual Studio just to highlight and implement that interface. And it's a pretty simple interface. You have to raise an event every time a property changes. So we can go ahead and just write a little function that will do that. Let's say void raise property change. We'll have string for the property that's changed. And all we have to do is just say if somebody is synchronized up to that event, then notify them from this object with some data that tells them which property just changed. It's just a string. Now what we need to make sure is that whenever our properties change in these setters here, that we notify any interested party that those properties have changed. Let's do exactly that. I'll just add a few simple member variables here for these properties. So we'll just add, I guess I'll do them down here at the bottom of the class. String for first name, string for last name, and int for age. And then I'll just rewrite these properties here just to use those. So we'll just say that what happens here is in the get, we simply return first name, and in the set, what we do is we say first name equals the value, and then we have to raise the property change for first name. Similar thing for last name here. What we do is that in the get, what we need to do is just go and say, okay, this returns the last name, and then we can say that in the set, we set the last name to be the value, and we raise the property change notification around the last name. So we kind of do that as well. And a bit tedious, but we're going to have to do it as well for age. Usually you would use a little snippet inside of Visual Studio for this, make it easier. Let's just say return age. Let's say age equals the value passed, and let's say raise property change of age. Okay, let's press F5 again, having created our new class that is a little bit more dynamic. Hopefully now when we change this to Bob, you see that the data that's being bound to over here automatically changes to Bob. So we've got proper data changes going on now with controls bound to our underlying data, so that all kind of makes sense. Now, something that you commonly encounter in binding is the notion of conversion. So just in a simple sense, let's imagine that I didn't want this text block anymore. Let's get rid of that. And let's do something like insert, let's go and grab a rectangle, for instance, and we'll just paint a rectangle here. So there we've got our rectangle. And imagine what I want to do is if the age is over a certain value, I want to display this rectangle as red, and otherwise I want to display it as green. So what I could do in quite an unusual way in some ways is I want to actually bind the data binding of the rectangle to the age. So I want the fill of the rectangle to be data bound to the age. However, the age is an integer and the fill is a brush, and you can't make a natural binding between integers and brushes. So we have the notion of conversion in the system to allow for this kind of situation. And the way it works is you build a little converting class. So let's just go over to our solution and we'll write a little converting class. So we'll just go ahead and say add a new class. We'll call this age to brush converter, something like that. It's a little bit odd. I mean, I wouldn't normally do this necessarily, but just trying to show you the sort of flexibility. And so in a nutshell, not really doing this completely, what we can do is implement an interface called iValueConverter. Let's just go and implement that. So I'll just get Visual Studio to pick up the namespace for me. Let's just get it to fix that. And let's just get it to implement the interface as well. Excuse me. Let's just go and get it to implement the interface as well. And so what you get is basically converting from one thing to the other. So that's going to be converting from an age to a brush, and converting back from a brush to an age. I'm not going to do converting back. Let's just do a simple thing here. Let's say, okay, let's get the age, which will be the value as an integer. And again, being very simple here, let's just say that we're going to make a solid color brush. We'll call this brush equals a new one of those. And we'll say if age is less than, I don't know, 40, then we'll have the color green, and if otherwise we'll have the color red or orange, something like that. Let's have orange, and then let's just return that brush. So very simple. We're just saying, okay, we're taking the integer value and trying to turn it into a color. So we've now got this age to brush converter. Let me just save that, pop back over to our UI definition in the XAML here. I want to use one of those things now. I'm actually going to declare one in the XAML. So let's just go up to the top of our XAML file and let's declare in here inside of my resources. And if you've watched our XAML video, you'll know about resources and how those kind of things work. There's another tutorial on that. I'm going to declare an instance of that converter and give it a key of my converter. So again, if you watch the XAML tutorial, you'll be familiar with this in some ways. Notice that the my XML namespace has already been brought in by the tooling for me here. It's just using the same namespace as my code, which allows me to declare one of those objects here. It's called myConverter. So let's now go down to our binding on the rectangle and specify that we are using a converter, and the converter is a resource which we look up using a static resource lookup, which is myConverter, I think we called it. So that's what it's saying. So what we're saying is we're doing a binding to the age property, but you have to use conversion and look up this object here and use it. That's kind of how that works. If we run back up to the top of the file, there's that converter. So what we should see is if we press F5 on this and run it inside of the browser, is that the age is green, but I think if we set it to 45, and notice that at the moment this isn't working because we didn't update our binding on that age property properly. Let me just go and find that binding. We need to make sure this is set as a two-way binding as well, and actually we probably should do that on our first name property while we're here, and our last name property, which is the one we haven't done. So let's just press F5 again on that. We should be able to see that as we're using lower values, let me just get rid of that, as we're using lower values here, 22 is giving us a green value, 50 for instance will give us an orange value, and once again 12 will give us a green value and 90 will give us an orange value. So we have this capability whereby, and we can do this in a two-way manner as well, you can convert on bindings that aren't necessarily quite natural bindings as to how those things work. So perfectly possible to make that sort of thing happen for a UI. So that's quite a powerful thing to be able to do. Now, there are lots more subtleties to establishing these bindings. There's lots of properties you can set here. For instance, you can specify things like fallback values for if the binding can't be made, if you like a sort of default value. You can specify string formats. How should the string be formatted? Maybe it's a date or a currency or something like that. What values should be used if the binding results in a null? And that works in a two-way so that somebody can effectively type a null into the user interface and have that work as well. Things like when to update bindings, and then a whole bunch of things around how validation is performed as data comes in through the UI, so we can do lots of different things there. I won't drill into these in this particular tutorial. Just one that I will talk about perhaps here, because it's quite a useful and sort of quite easy thing to demonstrate, is this idea of element binding. Sometimes you don't want to bind to an underlying object, you just want to bind to some other piece of UI, and that's reasonably easy to show here. So let's just get rid of our rectangle for a moment. That can go, and just from a graphical perspective, let's imagine that we just want to put a text block or something on the screen. So let's just have a text block there. Actually, let's do it a different way. Let's delete the text block and let's put a progress bar on the screen. So let's just find a progress bar. Let me just make sure I can sort this by name so I can see if I can find things. I'm going to find myself a progress bar. That's interesting. I don't actually see a progress bar on my toolbox here. So let's just go out to choose the items on the toolbox. We might as well talk a little bit about toolbox customization while we're here, and let's just see what we've got. Let's just find progress bar and just tick that and make sure it's included on my toolbox. Okay, great. So now I should have a progress bar, and if I just sort those alphabetically again, there's my progress bar. So let's go and draw a progress bar on here. There's a progress bar, and let's go and draw a simple slider on here. And I think I'm going to notice again that my toolbox is a little bit damaged, so let's just go and find a slider. There's the slider. Let's go and add that on there as well, and let's just draw a slider out there too. So we've got a slider and we've got a progress bar. Let's set the slider so that its properties of minimum should be 0, and let's make sure that maximum is set to 100. We'll just set it 0 to 100, and I think if we look at the progress bar, we'll spot that its maximum is also 100, so that's cool. So let's go ahead and say that, let's find the value of the progress bar, and let's establish a binding on this. So let's go and say what we want to do is apply a data binding. We haven't used this previously, but we could have used this area of Visual Studio before. Let's apply a data binding, and what we can say is we want to actually use an element, which is the slider, and the path on that element is to its value property. Let's just find that. And let's just make sure it should be kind of good. So let's just go and pop that down, and let's press F5 on our UI. I'll come back and look in the XAML in a second. And we should see, if I did that correctly, that the value of that progress bar is bound to this slider. So all the things that we already know about binding can also just be done element to element inside of something like this. It's not just about progress bars and sliders, of course. Quite a powerful thing in itself. Just showing you how that's set up in the XAML, all we've really done was, let's just find our progress bar here. So we said there's a progress bar, and we've said that its value is data bound to the element called slider1. And if we just scroll down just here, you can see that this, let me just get this size properly. This slider here is called slider1. And so what we're doing is we're saying the value of the progress bar is taken from the value of slider1. That's a property on that slider. And so we can do this element to element binding, which can be quite a powerful thing. Just a quick example of that there, and also building it up using the tooling a little bit more. Let me get rid of those two pieces and talk about something else. Everything we've seen so far has kind of related to having a single person. Maybe we've got a bunch of people and want to do something with a whole collection of people. So how would that work? Well, let's just go to our code where I think we set up the data context. And instead of just setting up one person here, let's create a collection of people and do it that way. So I'll just use a list or something like that. Let's just go and make a simple list. Very, very simple. We'll just say a new list of person, and then into that list of people we'll put this new person, which is Fred, and we'll put another one. This is just going to be obviously hard-coded for me. I'll just put 3 or something in here just to hard-code 3 people. And let's just change Fred. We'll have this one as Jim. He can be Jones, and he can be 33. And we'll also have Bob Brown, and he can be 44. So we've got this list of people that we're constructing. I think I've just missed a bracket there. Let's just fix that. So we've got this list of people with 3 people in it, which we're constructing at the time that we make this. Still don't have my syntax right there. Let's just close off that brace, open that brace, and make sure we get our syntax right here. Okay, that should be better. So we've got a nice list of people now. So what could we do with that? Let's go back to our user interface and let's take this grid that we currently have. I'm just going to collapse that down and comment it out, which I can just do with Control-K, Control-C in Visual Studio. And let's, instead of doing that, let's have a list box. A list box displays a bunch of items, as would a grid or something like that. And the way we set the items is we can set the item's source, and we could set it to be data bound. And in our case, we just set the data context of the whole control to be a list, so this list box now should be pulling its items from that list. Let's go and run that up and see where we end up. And so you'll notice that what we're doing is displaying 3 people as best the list box can. It doesn't actually know what to do with them. You can see that there's 3 people, but it doesn't know what to do with them. So we have a notion of having a sort of per item template to deal with this. So what we could do is we could say, okay, let's just go and say that the list box has an item template, and that is a thing called a data template. And then what I'll do is just uncomment this grid. So let's just go and grab this grid as it was. Let's just find all of this, hit Control-K, Control-U to uncomment it, and then I'm going to close off my data template. I'm going to close, oh excuse me, I did that wrong. I'm going to close off my data template. I'm going to close off my listbox item template. I'm going to close off my listbox. So what we just did essentially was say, okay, we have a listbox. It's bringing in a bunch of items on a per item basis. Display this. Press F5 on that to run it back up in the browser. And you'll notice that there's our data being displayed quite nicely. 3 items in a listbox on a per item basis. We've still got those bindings working just like they were before, and that's all working quite nicely. So this data binding concept is very, very powerful because it extends out to binding to collections of data, and then within those collections of data binding to individual elements, as you've already seen. So that all kind of spans out quite nicely. And we can also do some reasonably smart things around monitoring changes in collections. So if I went back to my code here, we have a class in our framework called an observable collection. So instead of using a list, I could use an observable collection. Let me just go and bring in the right namespace for that. I'm not sure if you can initialize an observable collection quite like that, but it looks like I might be getting away with it. That makes sure I can just compile. I think we changed this recently. Okay, so I can. An observable collection with 3 people in it. Well, what does that mean? Well, what's great about that is if I went back to my UI, and let's say I added a little piece of UI in order to make additions to this list. So let's just make sure we've got a little bit of space to do that. I'm just going to mark out a grid row or something on this grid that we've got at the top up here. Have we got a grid at the top? No, we've just got a list box. So let me just wrap that round with a grid. And then into the second row of my grid, I'll just mark out a row there. Into the second row of my grid, I'm just going to place a button. So I suppose we just go to the toolbox, grab a button, drag it into that grid row, and then I want to make sure that grid row auto-sizes itself to that button and reset all the layout on the button so it sizes nicely. Let's go to the properties on the button. Let's set its content to be add. And let's just write a little code behind that button. So we'll just handle its click event with a new event handler, and I'll just jump to the code for that. So that's going to be just inserted in my code file for me by Visual Studio. Let's just refactor that so that it's renamed as on add person, something like that. And at the point where we do this, what I should have done perhaps was kept around my observable collection so that I can access it here. There's ways of getting to it, but it would be nicest if I just had a member variable for it, which we'll call people, perhaps. I'm sorry, we've got a little so this is going to be the observable collection. I keep it around as a member variable on my class, and then I could say here this.people equals that collection, and I could make sure that the data context is set to the same thing, this.dataContext equals people. And then at the point where somebody clicks on this button, I could just add a new entry. So I could say this.people.add some new person, and on that new person, let's just go and make sure that we set up some first name of Mike, last name of Mills, let's say age equals 66. So we're just adding an item to that collection. Let's press F5 on our code again. And as we click that add button, notice that new entry just shows up in the list box. The list box, and generally speaking controls that display collections of things, know how to monitor for changes in the underlying data and just display them. So we just get that for free. We don't have to do any work in order to make that happen. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that we do around collections of data and binding to those collections of data. Okay, so we've seen some of the basics around data binding. We're not going to see everything around data binding here. That would be perhaps too long a topic. But what would be good would just to switch to Expression Blend and show something like that. Let me just close down this project in Visual Studio first. So let's just close this down. So let's just create a little library of code for Expression Blend to use. Let's just go and make a new project. We'll make a Silverlight class library. We'll call it My Library. And Silverlight 4 is the fine version to use. And I'm going to be pretty quick about this, really. Let's create an implementation of that interface I showed earlier on. We'll call this a public class, let's say property change notification. And let's implement that interface iNotify property change that we talked about. So I'm just writing a little class that will implement that. I just fix the namespace to bring in the right namespace for this. And I just use Visual Studio again to implement that interface. And then I'll just write a little method, protected void, raise property changed, and we'll just have string property, and we'll just say if property changed is not null, then fire the event property changed from this object with a new set of data saying which property it is that's just changed. So we've built that, that's fine, we've got property change notification. Let's then build a class, let's say for instance department, so we'll have department, and we'll make that derived from property change notification, and let's put some properties on there that do property change notification. I have a little snippet inside of my Visual Studio for this. It's just a custom snippet. You can add these to Visual Studio, and you'll notice that what it does is it gives me a property. We can say department name, something like that, and it just builds that up for me and raises the property change notification. Let's have another one, let's say something like manager, something like that, and let's have another one which might be something like the budget for the department. So we'll have a decimal, we'll call that budget. And then we might have some employees in the department, so let me write another class, which is a public class employee. It's going to be a property change notification derived class, and let me put some simple properties on here as well. So we'll have a property called first name, let's have a property called last name, and let's have some kind of property, maybe an integer for employee ID or something like that. So 3 simple properties on those employees, so we've got those there, and that's our class employee. Let's go back to our department and give it a list of employees. So we'll say property change, list of employee, call that employees, and I'll just make sure that that namespace is brought in by Visual Studio. So we've got some simple properties on our department here. We've got the department name, we've got the manager, we've got the budget, and we've got a list of employees. And normally we'd go and actually get the data from somewhere, but let's just put a method on here to simulate that with some load, and we'll just return some hardwired data. So we'll just say this.department equals, let's say it's the Xbox department, this.manager equals Xbox manager, this.budget, let's give the Xbox department a big budget, so 100, 123, 123. 100 million, that should be enough for them to be getting on with. And let's just go and create some employees. Just quickly, we'll say this.employees equals new list of employees, and into that list I'm just going to add 2 employees. So I'll have a new employee, and that can have first name is Fred, last name is Smith, and his ID is 1. And let's just copy that and create another one in that list. Excuse me while I just get that right. And so we got another employee here, and that can be Bob Jones, and he can be employee ID 2. Let's build this to make a little library, and that's built. And then let's pop over to Expression Blend. So let's pop over to Blend, and in Blend let's make a new project. A Silverlight application is fine for what we're doing here. Let me just size that artboard so that it fits in the middle of the screen. And let's go over to our project in Blend and add a reference to the code we just wrote, which is in my library. So let's just open that and add a reference to that. From there, let's say that we wanted to start designing something on this form. So very simply, let's take a text block, for instance, and just drag it out onto the top of this form. Let's set the font to be kind of large. So let's just find the font and set it to be something big. 18 point is fine, and I want this to be my department name. So how do I connect this to data? Well, I can go to the Data tab in Blend, and we could specify that we want a data source. We can either have a sample data source or a real data source. So let's make a real data source from an object, and that object is going to be a department. So we just click OK, and then what we want to do is take that department name. What we want to do is take that department data source and just drag it onto the form, where the tooltip says, do you want to make this the data context? And the answer is yes. I can then go to my text block, for instance. Let's just, let's just find that. And we could find a property on that text block in the properties window down here, like the text property. And it has this little control next to it where we can set up data bindings. We could say I want to use the department name and click OK. Now the problem is everything then disappears. And that's because no department name is set by default on one of these departments. This is a bit tricky for me to work with. So the other option that Blend has is the idea that I can also add sample data generated for me by Blend. So for instance, I can select a department, and then what I can say is let's take that and drag it over. Now it might look like I'm creating 2 data contexts here, but one will be used at design time and one at runtime. And what we get is a random generated set of data. So you can see here that this is being generated by Blend. I can use it as a company name, for instance. A Datum Corporation is not a bad match, and that will do really for what I need there. Let's also drag out some text blocks for things like maybe the manager or something. Let's just take a text block. Let's do that binding trick again just to bind that up. Just make sure we've got the right thing selected. Let's just go and find its text and bind that once again. We want this bound to the manager. Let's just go and bind that up. And that sample data is not too clever really, so let's just change the manager into a different kind of sample. Let's say this is actually a name. So it's Jesper Aberg who is managing this department. Let's set that to be a 14, 16 point font, something like that. Just line it up there. And let's put the budget somewhere on here. We won't really be fancy about it. We'll take another text block, drag it out onto the design surface, make sure we've got it selected, find its text, click again to data bind it, and we'll just go for the budget over there. And I'll just place that over in the right hand corner here. I'm not going to be too fancy about it. Then what we might want is the employees. So we would take something like a list box. I'm just going to mark out a separate area on my grid for that list box here. We take something like a list box. Let's just go and find one of those things. Drag it out into this area. Let me just select it to make sure that it is auto-sizing itself in both directions. And we'd want to take something like the employees over here and drag them out and get them to bind onto that list box. Now notice that again this is using test data at the moment, so we just say we probably want first name to be a name again. Not going to be quite right this, but it doesn't really matter too much. Last name again to be a name. It's not perfect in terms of what we wanted, but it's not too far away. What also happened at that point was that Expression Blend realized that we would need a template in order to display the items in the list box. We saw this previously. So on this particular list box, what we can do is go and edit that template which is being used, and you see it's 3 different text blocks. I'd probably want the first name to come first, so let's just reorder that up there, and the last name to come last. And then the age is fine, and I think it was employee ID, wasn't it? And we typically add a whole bunch more controls here in order to make this actually do something, but this is good enough for my purposes. So I can come out of that template editing. Perhaps I'd move this grid row up here. If we just select the grid, I'd perhaps just move that up a little bit. So we kind of done some work in terms of binding things there, but if we press F5 inside of Expression Blend to run the application, I think we'll find that we haven't actually got any data. And that's because we had to call the load method in order to get some data. But I think we've set everything up kind of correctly. If we just went and inserted a button over here, let's drop it into this grid row, and let's just make sure that it's auto-sizing itself. And maybe we'll just quickly change a property or two on the button. Let's just change its content to be something like load. Then what we could do is go back to our representation of the data up here and just try and drag this load method out onto that button. Do you want to call this load method? Bear with me 1 second. I think I'm dropping the wrong one. That's from my sample data. Let me just make sure I'm dragging this from the right place. I'm not sure it really makes any difference, but I'll just make sure that we're dragging that from the right place. And what Blend just did was give me capability to call that method using a thing called a behavior. So what should happen is now at runtime we should be seeing that button, and we click load, and you can see we're getting our real data from the underlying object model. And notice how everything was kind of set up via binding. The power of this, and even the power to be able to switch between design time data and runtime data, is all facilitated, just to show you a little XAML for a moment, by binding. And it's the fact that our controls in here are simply bound to first name, last name, and employee ID. That's what we show in the particular list box. And then we've also got some controls bound to, where are we? Department name, manager, and budget, and that's how we display our main data on the screen. So all this functionality really still comes back to binding, and all of the things you expect to be able to set up via binding are also things you can set up via Blend. So hopefully this gives you a flavor of binding. I haven't taught you through everything in Silverlight 4. There's a lot more you can do with binding, but it really does form almost the heart of the platform and its capabilities with data, so it's really worth getting a good view as to what binding can do for you inside of Silverlight.